Something wicked this way comes. The problem with the American Christmas was its relentless, blinding optimism. It was a suffocating layer of synthetic snow, LED twinkle, and saccharine cheer designed to smother any hint of the darkness from which the holiday truly sprang. For Elias Vance, a man whose professional life was dedicated to excavating that darkness, December in the town of Oak Haven, Vermont, felt less like a celebration and more like a fever dream of forced happiness. Elias was a folklorist, a purist, he insisted, who specialized in the pre-Christian and often brutal origins of winter traditions. He saw the modern, jolly Santa Claus not as a kindly figure, but as a heavily marketed erasure of Perchta, the terrifying alpine witch, and the chaotic Norse deity Odin, who rode the skies during the wild hunt. This year, however, his academic disinterest was curdling into genuine unease. Oak Haven was normally picturesque, the kind of New England town that Architectural Digest visited in autumn. But the first week of December had brought an unseasonal, heavy, wet snow, followed by an abrupt, unnatural cold snap that froze the sludge solid. The festive lights, strung across the colonial-era homes and wrapped around the tall maples lining Main Street, seemed to flicker with an exhausted effort, their primary colors bleeding into the oppressive gray of the sky. The mood was off. It began subtly, as true folklore threats often do. Elias first noticed it in the town's annual winter market. Vendors, usually boisterous and competitive, spoke in hushed, brittle tones. Mrs. Peterson's famous gingerbread men, normally flawless, were coming out of the oven with unsettlingly elongated limbs, their sugary smiles seeming strained and unnatural. Children, usually running riot through the stalls in search of candy canes, clung to their parents' coats, their wide eyes reflecting the dull gray light. Then came the sounds. They started after midnight, a faint, scraping noise that seemed to originate from the frozen forest bordering the town's western edge. Elias lived in a small, historic cottage near the woods, a perfect location for quiet research. He had initially dismissed the sound as wind shifting the ice-laden branches, but it wasn't the wind. It was rhythmic, almost like a slow, deliberate raking motion. Shcrack, shcrack. It had a calculating cadence, the sound of something large and purposeful, dragging itself across the frozen ground, drawing closer with each passing night. He consulted his texts. He scoured his worn, annotated copy of Jacob Grimm's Teutonic mythology. The scraping, the unnatural cold, the failure of cheer, all were traditional harbingers of the winter witches. Not the benevolent Italian gift-giver La Befana, but the punitive, visceral entities, Perchta, who slit the bellies of the slothful, or Frau Halle, who in her dark aspect presided over malevolent storms and the souls of unbaptized infants. Elias tried to be rational, a small-town mood shift, a weird weather pattern, a bit of shared seasonal stress, but the rationality was dissolving under the weight of the evidence. The worst incident was at the Oak Haven Elementary School's annual pageant rehearsal. The first graders were practicing Jingle Bells. Midway through the chorus, the lead soloist, a sweet girl named Lily with pigtails and a chipped front tooth, stopped dead. Her face went slack, her eyes fixed on the auditorium's upper corner. "Lily, what is it, dear?" the music teacher, Miss Davies, asked gently. Lily didn't answer. She only raised a trembling finger and pointed. Her voice, when it came, was a terrified whisper that carried perfectly through the sudden absolute silence of the auditorium. "The woman is watching. She is waiting for the naughty ones." The entire classroom saw nothing, but the rehearsal was abandoned. The next day, Lily's family pulled her out of school, citing a sudden, mysterious case of fever. Elias felt the hairs stand up on his arms when he heard the story. He recognized the pattern. A child seeing what the adults were willfully blind to, a common trope in folklore when a supernatural boundary was being breached. The fading cheer wasn't just a mood, it was a symptom. The aggressive, enforced happiness of the American Christmas was dissolving, and something older, crueler, and infinitely more demanding was slipping through the gaps. He poured himself a glass of lukewarm whiskey and walked to his study window. The moon was obscured by a thick, bruised layer of clouds. In the distance, the scraping sound began again, closer this time and unmistakable. It wasn't a branch, it was heavy. Sh-crack, sh-crack. It was the sound of a long, sharp object being dragged with effort, perhaps the claw of a massive foot, or maybe the pole of a primitive sled. Elias picked up his oldest research notebook, a leather-bound volume filled with decades of handwritten notes on protective sigils and pagan rituals. He looked out at the lights of Oakhaven, twinkling defiantly against the encroaching gloom. They were inadequate. He knew with a certainty that chilled him deeper than the Vermont winter, that they were facing something that would not be satisfied with eggnog, carols, or shiny red bows. The shifting focus of fear. The night of December 5th descended upon Oakhaven, not with the celebrated chaos of European tradition, but with a silent, paralyzing dread. Elias, hunched over his oak desk, could date the peak of his terror to this night. Krampus knocked. In the old world, this was the moment of reckoning, the night the horned shadow followed St. Nicholas to administer corporal punishment. In Oakhaven, Vermont, it was merely the eve of the town annual tree-lighting ceremony, a symbol of the cheer Elias knew was already hollowed out. He had spent the day cataloging the sounds he'd heard, cross-referencing them with his research on Alpine and Germanic winter entities. The rhythmic sh-crack, sh-crack he had first identified as scraping was now clearer, sharper. It was the sound of a krumpin, the heavy wooden pole or rake traditionally wielded by Perchta with a krampus to drag away the wicked, its frozen iron hook catching on the icy gravel of the roads. More unsettling still was the faint, rusty jingle he now occasionally heard mixed in, the sound of chains, heavy and antique, rattling not in celebration, but in menace. Elias hypothesized that the entity, whether Perchta, Krampus, or a localized, centuries-suppressed Puritan boogeyman echoing their power, was not merely visiting, it was adapting. It was drawing sustenance from the most potent source of fear available in the modern American Yuletide, the guilt, the anxiety, and the relentless pressure to be good. The focus of the town's fear was rapidly shifting.
It was no longer the existential dread of something unseen. It was the specific, terrifying fear of judgment. The first tangible sign appeared on Mrs. Albright's porch. Mrs. Albright was a beloved, if slightly gossipy, elder who ran the town's most popular Christmas ornament shop. When she woke up, pinned to her front door with a sliver of broken ice was a single, hand-stitched silk stocking. It was empty, save for a small, brittle square of parchment bearing 2 lines, written in a spidery, unsettling script that looked like frost patterns. The lie you told on the 10th of July about the inheritance. The poor quality of the stitching on the angels you sold to the church. The details were intimate, petty, and horrifyingly accurate. Mrs. Albright, who had always been a bastion of Christmas spirit, shut her shop immediately and refused to answer her door, the sound of her frantic sobs occasionally reaching the street. The naughty list was no longer a children's threat. It was a public indictment. December 26th, St. Stephen's Day, the day after Christmas, the traditional start of the wild hunt's deepest season. Elias looked out at the street. The scraping was gone, but the echo of the chains remained, vibrating in the soles of his boots. He now understood. The Krampusnacht visit was merely the warning. The full power of the winter witch was scheduled for Christmas, and she was coming to harvest not fear, but the specific, bitter fruit of broken honesty. He knew what he had to do. The town wouldn't perform the ritual of honesty, so he would have to find a way to perform an act of sacrifice and genuine purity big enough to appease a vengeful deity, alone, before the final, brutal judgment of St. Stephen's Day. He was the only one who believed, and therefore, he was the only one who could possibly stop her. He was now running on pure, terrified conviction. The hearthside whispers, ancient tales of the winter hag. The sound of shattering glass and the cold sting of the discarded switches were still vivid in Elias's mind, but the raw terror of the town hall had been replaced by a laser-like intellectual focus. He had been rejected by the town. They had chosen panic and denial over ancient wisdom. Very well. The reckoning on St. Stephen's Day would be his burden alone. He retreated to the sanctuary of his cottage, not for rest, but for the crucible of his scholarship. The lights were on, the whiskey untouched. The only sound was the frantic turning of pages, his own breathing, and, distantly, the low, insidious whirring that he had barely registered at the town hall, masked by the panic and the rattling chains. It was a subtle, high-pitched noise, thin as spun thread, and far more terrifying than any monstrous roar. Elias laid out his texts, abandoning the generic volumes on Krampus for his most specialized, carefully preserved books, leather-bound treatises on the European winter witches, the hag aspect of the Yuletide spectrum. He focused on the trinity of punitive female figures, Perta, Frau Holla or Holda, and the darker strain of La Befana. These were not mere monsters of the night. They were domestic deities, intimately concerned with the order and ethics of the hearthside. The common thread, the true obsession of the winter hag, was weaving and spinning. He read aloud, muttering the key passages to burn them into his memory. Perta, or the belly slitter, appeared during the 12 nights of Yuletide. She judges those who are lazy in their spinning and leaves their flax undone, or worse, destroys the work of the dishonest. She seeks not the child who is merely naughty, but the woman or servant who shirked their duties at the wheel, for cleanliness and industry are sacred to her domain. Frau Holla, the keeper of the well and mistress of the weather, demands that all spinning be finished before the holy night. To leave the wheel turning or the distaff full of wool during the 12 nights is to invite her terrifying judgment, bringing ill fortune and storms of unnatural frost. The whispers of the hearthside were not about grand satanic pacts. They were about the smallest, most essential acts of a domestic life, the meticulous, monotonous work of preparation and honesty. The aggressive, manufactured cheer of Oakhaven was a perfect target. Everything was new, plastic, and mass-produced. No one spun thread. No one truly labored for the quality of their warmth. The town was built on a superficial, decorative layer of goodness that the ancient hag would see as a profound, dishonest laziness. He slammed the book shut. The hag required a focus, a central point of power related to her craft, a domestic shrine of untruth. He immediately thought of the high-pitched whirring he had heard at the town hall. It wasn't static. It was a spinning wheel. But whose? Who in Oakhaven possessed and actually used an antique spinning wheel? He scanned his mental map of the town, past the mayor and the merchants, past the school, focusing on the marginal figures the town had ignored or marginalized. He remembered Agnes Crofton. Agnes was a hermit, a former art professor who had withdrawn from society decades ago. She lived in a small, weathered farmhouse on the outermost edge of Oakhaven, where the town's meticulously groomed lawns gave way to unkempt fields and the tangled darkness of the deeper woods. She was known, if she was known at all, for her obsessive collection of ancient porcelain dolls, her profound aversion to Christmas celebrations, and critically, the massive iron-banded antique spinning wheel visible through her dusty front window. The town had always dismissed Agnes as the local eccentric, harmless if a little mad. But to Elias, she was the key. She represented the unintegrated, old-world domesticity that the hag commanded. If the Winter Witch was manifesting locally, she would need to attach herself to a suitable ritual vessel, and Agnes's house, with its constant, lonely industry, was the only working hearthside left in Oakhaven. The whirring noise, he realized with a shudder, was not just in the air, it was coming from Agnes's house. But why was the wheel spinning now, 4 days before Christmas? According to the texts, the spinning had to be finished by this time. To leave it running was to invite the most brutal form of judgment. Unless, he reread the section on Perta's judgment of the dishonest spinner. What if the hag wasn't punishing Agnes, but possessing her work? What if the hag was spinning a wicked thread, a thread of judgment that would bind the entire town? The hag's punishment often involved replacing the finished thread in the bowl with dirt, stones, or snakes, symbolizing the uncleanliness of the soul. The scraping sound, the krompen, was not just a rake, it was the sound of her clearing the path, preparing to bring the dirt of judgment to the heart of Oakhaven. He had to get to Agnes's house, not to save her, but to interrupt the weaving of the wicked thread before it was complete. He went to his supply cabinet. He needed protective elements specific to the winter hag, not just general protections against demons. 1. The gruel. Hola and Perta demanded appeasement. It was always a simple, humble meal, a bowl of unsalted porridge or gruel, something honest and unadorned. He quickly mixed a simple bowl of oatmeal with water, leaving it deliberately tasteless. Honesty and humility. 2. The iron. Iron was anathema to most fey and winter entities. He found an old heavy handbell, not for ringing, but as a protective barrier. 3. The plant. He needed a boundary plant, not evergreen, too associated with modern Christmas, but rowan, the mountain ash, the classic tree of protection against witches in the north. He had a dried sprig from an autumn excursion. He put the items into a worn canvas bag. Outside, the air was still and lethally cold, the kind of cold that seemed to suck the sound out of the world. He started his car. The town was utterly dark. Only a few scattered security lights pierced the gloom, casting long, nervous shadows that seemed to twitch in his peripheral vision. As he drove toward the outskirts, past the deserted commercial strip, he saw the telltale signs of the hag's encroaching power. In front of the darkened market, the artificial snow, the synthetic fluff that covered every window display, was visibly, unnaturally rotting. It was dissolving into a sticky, gray, malodorous sludge like dirty wool that had been left out to foul. Uncleanliness and corruption. He reached Agnes's road. It was unpaved, slick with black ice, and lined with skeletal, frost-covered trees. Agnes's farmhouse stood alone, a dark, heavy silhouette against the bruised pre-dawn sky. There were no Christmas lights, no tinsel, no wreath. A perfect domestic island of neutrality in the war zone of Oakhaven's forced holiday cheer. First, The chains. A distant, heavy jingle that seemed to be patrolling the perimeter of the field, closer than ever before. And then, louder than he could have imagined, clearer than the town hall whisper, came the sound from within the small, dark farmhouse, the frantic, rhythmic, and deeply malevolent whirring of the spinning wheel. Whirr, kunk, whirr, kunk, whirr, kunk. It was spinning too fast, the sound not of industry, but of obsession. The hag was inside, spinning the final, wicked thread of Oakhaven's doom. Elias gripped the canvas bag, the unsalted gruel cold against his hand. He knew the next move had to be precise, ritualistic, and performed before the thread was woven. The hearthside whispers had given him the location. Now he had to face the ancient tale made real. Beyond the tinsel, a secret history of American Yuletide. Elias stood motionless by his sedan, the car idling faintly on the ice-crusted dirt road leading to Agnes Crofton's house. The air was a vacuum of sound and warmth, punctuated only by the frantic whirr junk of the spinning wheel from within the house and the distant chilling jingle of patrolling chains. He was about to step onto the grounds of a physical manifestation of ancient fear, and instinct demanded a final intellectual pause. He pressed his back against the frozen metal of his car, his mind racing through the historical rationale. Why here? Why now? The true horror of Oakhaven wasn't just the existence of the hag, it was the realization that the American Christmas was the perfect kindling for her rage. Elias had dedicated his life to this concept, the suppression of the dark, messy origins of winter celebration. When the English pilgrims and the stern Puritans landed on these shores, they brought with them a profound distrust of Yuletide revelry, seeing it as a drunken, pagan chaos. They actively banned Christmas in many colonies. But European traditions, especially those from German and Dutch immigrants, persisted. They couldn't ban the cold, the darkness, and the deep primal need for a midwinter reckoning. The winter hag figures, Perchta, Frau Holle, and Knecht Ruprecht, were not eradicated, they were merely driven into the shadows, their punishments deemed too brutal for the increasingly sanitized American narrative. In their place, a new figure was created, a clean slate, Santa Claus. Santa Claus, Elias realized, was the ultimate act of American historical revisionism. He wasn't just a friendly gift giver, he was the final successful replacement of fear with commerce and synthetic joy. Beyond the tinsel lay not just the old tales, but the systematic, centuries-long effort to lie about the cost of the season. The naughty list, Elias thought, is a powerless, consumer-friendly copy of Perchta's Register of Sins. It promises punishment, but delivers only coal, a minor inconvenience. The hag delivers true judgment. Oakhaven's enforced, gleaming cheer was a monument to this lie. The town spent thousands on lights, decorations, and gifts, a hyper-capitalist distraction from the very real anxiety of their lives. They had successfully suppressed the ancient, painful truth that winter required honesty, humility, and genuine human labor to survive. This, Elias knew, was why the hag was feeding now. She was drawn to the colossal tension between the sanitized, debt-fueled celebration and the underlying guilt of a town that had forgotten how to be truly clean, thrifty, or honest. Elias pulled out a small, laminated printout from his bag, a piece of local history he'd found years ago, a 17th-century woodcut, crude and fiercely suppressed, showing a cloaked figure, clearly European in origin, but labeled in shaky English as the house cleaner, come to see the unfinished work. It was a direct, terrifying transplant of Frau Holle into the nascent American landscape, instantly banished from the official narrative. This was the secret history. It was the Crofton family, Agnes's ancestors, who had been among the few early German-American settlers in the area, clinging to their isolated farms and their old-world folklore. While the Yankees were busy banning Christmas, the Croftons were quietly ensuring their spinning was done before the 12 nights, lest the house cleaner find their house wanting. Elias had a chilling flash of insight. Agnes Crofton wasn't just a random hermit. She was the unwilling final heir to a protective lineage. Her antique spinning wheel wasn't a hobby. It was a sacred, functioning remnant of the old-world ethic. When the town's collective guilt, the lie of the perfect Christmas, reached a tipping point, the hag didn't need to physically travel from the Alps. She merely possessed the closest, most suitable nexus point, the last true hearthside left in Oakhaven, and hijacked Agnes's ritual. The frantic, malevolent whirring now wasn't Agnes weaving a protective thread. It was the hag weaving the town's shroud of uncleanness. Elias quickly reviewed his supplies: the iron bell, protection, and the unsalted gruel, humility. But the hag only accepted honesty. He needed to offer a counter symbol, an embodiment of the lie she was here to punish. He scanned his car. On the floor mat, half hidden by slush, was a string of broken, discarded LED lights, garishly bright plastic tubing, cut through by his tire earlier in the week, tinsel, plastic, synthetic cheer. He snatched them up. This was the perfect sacrifice. The hag had been summoned by the American lie. Perhaps she could be banished by the offering of the lie itself. Elias's final plan: 1. Breach the threshold. Use the iron bell as a barrier to enter the physical space without being instantly claimed by the malevolence. 2. Offer the truth. Leave the unsalted gruel on the hearth, an act of humble, pre-modern appeasement dedicated to the spirit of genuine work and cleanliness. 3. Confront the source. Approach the spinning wheel and offer the broken LED lights, the synthetic lie of the American Yuletide, forcing the hag, who demands purity, to confront the corruption she is feeding on. The ultimate gamble. Will she consume the lie and be trapped, or will she reject the offering and consume him? The chains jingled again, much closer this time, accompanied by a faint, wet schlock-schlock sound, as if something heavy were dragging wet, rotting material. It was the sound of the hag bringing her rewards, the foul, dirty wool and sludge she gifted the lazy. Elias took a final, shuddering breath, the cold burning his lungs. He was no longer a detached academic. He was a lone practitioner of a forgotten history, standing at the junction of the 17th century Puritan fear and the 21st century capitalist excess. He gripped the iron bell, the brittle plastic of the broken LED lights, and the bowl of gruel. It was time to step beyond the tinsel and into the secret, terrifying history that had finally caught up with Oakhaven. He opened a car door and stepped out onto the frozen ground, his boots crunching loudly in the sudden, deep silence before the inevitable chaos.
Deciphering the lost grimoires. Elias Vance raised the heavy black iron bell, its cold surface immediately drawing the heat from his gloved hand. He was one step from Agnes Crofton's porch, the threshold of the hag's crucible. The frantic, malevolent whirring of the spinning wheel was deafening, vibrating in the soles of his boots. But as he prepared to step forward, a sound from the backyard froze him. The heavy, rhythmic clang-scrape of the chains was circling, moving too fast, cutting off his only retreat. He realized his plan, the gruel, the iron, the broken lights, was based on generic appeasement. It was academic theory, not the precise ritualistic counter-magic required to defeat a manifesting deity. He was missing a piece of the puzzle, a vital secret. A bitter taste flooded his mouth, tasting like regret and frozen ink. He knew exactly where that piece of information lay, buried deep within the brittle, forbidden pages that had consumed his life.
The Lost Grimoires. The darkness outside Agnes's house dissolved, replaced by the yellow, dust-filled glow of a subterranean library in Leipzig a decade ago. This was the source of his obsession, the genesis of his ruin, and now the potential source of his salvation. He remembered the electric shock of discovery when his fingers first brushed against the Compendium of the Wild Hunt, a Puritan-era manuscript bound in blackened human leather. The volume was banned on 3 continents, a raw, unfiltered account of the pre-Christian entities the settlers truly feared. It was a history written in terror, not revisionism. That book wasn't just research, it was Elias's lifeblood. It contained the forgotten names and the secret vulnerabilities of every punitive winter spirit, from the Icelandic Yule lad's monstrous mother to the Siberian hag of the needle. He had sacrificed his tenure, the respect of his colleagues, and ultimately his marriage, to possess and study it. His wife Clara had left him not for infidelity, but for obsession, the single-minded pursuit of a truth no one else wanted to see. "You love the ghosts more than the living, Elias," she had said, signing the divorce papers. He felt the cold New England air rush back into his lungs, pulling him from the flashback. He was here now because of that obsession. He focused on the final, most maddening section of the compendium, a single half-charred folio containing the supposed verse of unraveling. It was written in a near-illegible mixture of archaic German and coded Puritan slang, rendered almost entirely useless by mold and fire damage. He ran the imagery of the hag, spinning, cleanliness, debt, through the mental filters of his decades of decoding. The hag demanded payment for the unpaid debt of the town's spiritual laziness. What was the true nature of the weaving? The compendium didn't call the hag Percha or Holla in that final verse. It used an entirely different epithet. Elias squeezed his eyes shut, forcing the brittle, damaged letters from the page to reassemble in his mind. The key wasn't woolen thread, literal. It was the woeful fleece, a metaphor. In Puritan dialect, fleece referred to anything acquired through trickery or usury. In German peasant lore, it meant the skin and wealth taken from the judged. The hag was spinning a shroud of collective moral debt. The crucial final word of the verse of unraveling suddenly clicked into place, not through linguistic analysis, but through sheer, terrified intuition. The damaged word, which he had always read as guilt, was, in the archaic Puritan cursive, unmistakably gift. The line read, "The weaver of unpaid debts doth halt her work only when the final, truest gift is given." The hag wouldn't be stopped by gruel or iron. She required a sacrifice, a genuine gift paid for with something intrinsically valued, something that represented a true personal cost, not merely an appeasement. Elias looked down at the canvas bag. The gruel was humility. The lights were the lie. But what was his earned gift? What was the one thing he valued most, the thing that had cost him everything and defined his existence? His obsession, his knowledge, the compendium of the Wild Hunt. The grimoire was the sum total of his life, the truth he had sought in the dark corners of history. To destroy it or to surrender it to the hag would be to erase his entire professional existence and his solitary purpose. It was the only object in his possession truly earned by sacrifice. Elias reached into his jacket. He didn't carry the entire massive book, but he always carried the small, brittle, and hidden frontispiece, which contained the hag's epithets and the verses of unraveling, the most dangerous, most powerful pages. He pulled out the oilskin packet. The pages felt fragile and vital in his hand. He had intended to use this knowledge to write the definitive book that would finally validate his life's work. Now he would use it as the final, true gift, the sacrifice of his obsession. The whirring inside the house escalated into a frantic, hysterical shriek, and the heavy chains in the back field began to drag faster, scraping a terrible rhythm of approaching judgment. Crash, scrape, crash, scrape. Elias lifted the iron bell, not to ring it, but to use its iron weight as a protective shield. He clutched the bowl of gruel and the broken LED lights in his left hand and the fragile packet of the compendium's secret pages in his right. He took the final step onto the porch. The air immediately thickened, smelling of ozone, dust, and deeply cold, rotting wool. The door, unsecured by any lock, groaned open. Elias Vance, the scholar who had traded his life for forbidden knowledge, stepped across the threshold, ready to pay the ultimate price to the weaver of unpaid debts with the sacrifice of his deepest obsession. The secret history was about to become horrifyingly, violently present. The Shadowy Sisterhood, tracing the lineage of La Befana and Percha. Elias stepped across the warped threshold of Agnes Crofton's house, raising the heavy black iron bell like a shield. The air inside was dense and frigid, yet carried the unmistakable smell of deep-fried tallow and the choking dust of millennia. It was the stench of neglected domestic duty. The room was a chaos of antique furniture and long-forgotten textiles. In the center, illuminated by the sickly yellow glow filtering through a grimy window, stood the spinning wheel. It was a monstrous 6-foot-tall contraption of oak and iron, spinning with a frantic, desperate speed that seemed to defy friction. And there was the weaver. She was not a horned monster of the Krampus variety, but something infinitely worse. A towering skeletal woman cloaked in rags that were not cloth, but hardened, matted filth and decaying wool. Her face, half hidden by a cowl, was a roadmap of judgment, hollow-eyed, bony, and set in a permanent, venomous snarl. She stood directly behind the spinning wheel, her long, rope-like fingers guiding the thread that was not linen, but a thick, gray, shimmering fiber that pulsed with captured light, the woeful fleece woven from Oakhaven's accumulated lies. This was the Americanized, fully malevolent Percha, the winter hag, manifest. Agnes Crofton was nowhere to be seen, completely subsumed or banished by the entity, using her hearthside as a portal. As Elias fully entered the room, the hag's attention snapped to him. The spinning wheel screamed to a stop, then instantly reversed, then reversed again, vibrating violently. The hag's voice, when it came, was a high, reedy whisper that cut like glass, the sound of every ignored chore and petty judgment given voice. The scholar, come to measure my debt with his false words? Elias stood his ground. He held up the bowl of unsalted gruel and the broken string of LED lights. I come to pay the debt of Oakhaven, Elias stated, his voice shaky but firm. The gruel is the true, honest labor of the hearthside. The tinsel is the dishonest, cheap joy they offered in its place. The hag let out a sound that was half hiss, half laughter, sharp and without mirth. Insolvents! I am the weaver of unpaid debts. I claim the whole town, their wealth and their warmth. Your offerings are insufficient, Elias Vance, and your own ledger is the blackest. You abandon the living for the dead. You are the greatest debtor here. The hag moved toward him, and as she did, the air crackled. The heavy chains outside began to rattle against the house foundation, demanding entry.
This was the moment of truth. Appeasement was useless. He had to hit her with the lore she couldn't outrun, the fundamental contradiction in her own mythology. "You are incomplete!" Elias shouted, dropping the gruel and the lights onto the floor. The hag paused, her terrifying eyes narrowing. "You are trapped, Percha! You are the shadowy sisterhood, and you cannot escape the cycle. You think you are the punisher, but you are only half the truth." He began his final, frantic recitation of the forgotten texts, his scholar's obsession becoming his weapon. "You are Percha, the punisher, who destroys the messy and slothful, but your lineage is bound to Frau Holly, who rewards the industrious, and your sister, whom the South remembers, is La Befana." He pointed to the spinning wheel, whose thread was the gray of shame. "La Befana, the good witch of the hearth, who climbs down the chimneys after the new year. She is the cleaner who sweeps away the old year's sins. She leaves gifts for the good and only coal for the truly naughty. She is the one who completes the cycle of judgment and redemption. But Oakhaven has suppressed her story. They have refused the judgment, and so you are stuck. You can only be the punitive Percha because you are denied the chance to become the rewarding Befana." The hag shrieked again, a sound of profound intellectual pain. "Silence! The debt is too great! The weaving must be finished!" She slammed her fist onto the spinning reel, sending the dense gray thread flying, wrapping around a dusty antique doll in the corner. The doll immediately began to weep tears of black sticky resin. The hag was showing him the fate of the town, bound, weeping, and ruined by their own uncleanliness. "No," Elias countered, his voice cracking with final resolve. "The only debt remaining is your own, the debt of your truth. The world forgot that the hag is both reward and ruin. To break the cycle, you need the truth of your own identity. You need the whole lineage." He pulled out the brittle, oil-skinned packet of pages, the fragments of the compendium of the Wild Hunt, containing the secret history of her twin identities. This was the final devastating gift, the sacrifice of the single thing he valued most. "Here is the truest gift," Elias yelled, throwing the fragile packet of pages onto the cold stone hearth. "The truth of who you are, the knowledge you seek, the history that defines you. I sacrifice my obsession to you." He withdrew the iron bell, crashing it down on the floor beside the hearth. The iron's proximity to the hag and the burning knowledge caused an immediate violent reaction. A searing blue-white light erupted from the pages on the hearth. It wasn't fire, it was pure, condensed ritual energy. The hag screamed, clutching her head, and stumbled back from the spinning wheel. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The wheel's manic whir-whir chunk slowed, groaning, resisting the truth, until with a final massive crack, the thread stopped. Then, impossibly, it began to spin backwards at lightning speed. The woeful fleece, the gray, shame-laden thread unraveled from the spool in seconds. As it touched the air, it didn't disappear. It dissolved into harmless, floating motes of clean, sweet-smelling white cotton. The hag's body began to shimmer, the matted filth falling away from her skeletal form like dry scale. She was no longer a towering monstrosity, but shrinking, condensing, becoming less defined, a mere shadow, writhing in the light of the burning pages. "Redemption! Incomplete! The cycle! I am bound!" With a final desperate gasp, the hag was sucked inward, vanishing with the sound of a strong, healthy gust of wind up a chimney. She was gone, vanished not by strength, but by the truth of her own shadowy sisterhood. Elias collapsed onto the dusty floor, the scent of fresh cotton and the lingering cold of iron washing over him. The crisis was averted. The debt was paid, not with money or false cheer, but with the painful, personal sacrifice of his knowledge. The only thing left on the hearth were the ashes of his compendium and the bowl of gruel, untouched, but now covered with a single, small, bright gold coin, the Befana's reward for the truly good. He had won, and in the silence he finally heard a faint, shallow breathing coming from the corner.
Agnes Crofton, asleep and alive. The scholar's obsession had saved the town, but the cost was the secret history he had sworn to protect. He leaned against the shattered spinning wheel, his lungs burning from the cold and the residual magical discharge. The hag was gone, dispersed by the forced truth of her own dual nature. The oppressive cold in the room lifted, replaced by the normal, biting chill of a Vermont December. He found Agnes Crofton huddled behind an antique wardrobe, still breathing, though her eyes were wide and glazed. She remembered nothing of the spinning wheel's malignant activity, only a profound, sudden wave of exhaustion that had made her sleep for hours. Elias, his academic obsession sacrificed to the blue flame on the hearth, felt an immediate crippling emptiness. He was victorious, yet profoundly unmoored. Before leaving, he retrieved the single small gold coin the hag, or rather the nascent Bifana, had left on the gruel. It was old, pure, and utterly alien. He slipped it into Agnes's coat pocket. A small, well-earned gift for the innocent, he thought. He reported the incident to Sheriff Brody as a break-in and subsequent disorientation caused by a chimney blockage. Sheriff Brody, like the rest of Oakhaven, eagerly accepted the mundane lie. "Just holiday stress, Dr. Vance. Too much time with those old books." The town was desperate to keep the tinsel firmly in place. The calm before the storm. Elias returned to his cottage, his head reeling. He was alive. The town was safe from immediate domestic judgment, and the reckoning on St. Stephen's Day, December 26th, had seemed to have been averted. He collapsed onto his sofa, his gaze drawn to the calendar hanging crookedly on the wall. He had been so focused on the hag's arbitrary date of judgment that he had overlooked the calendar's true, cosmic significance. The current date was December 20th. Tomorrow was December 21st. The winter solstice. The longest night. His blood ran cold. The hag was a domestic threat, a spirit of the hearthside concerned with chores and morality. But the solstice, Yuletide, was the most powerful liminal night of the year. It was the night the veil between the worlds thinned to nothing. It was the traditional night of the wild hunt. Elias realized with sickening clarity that the hag's appearance had been a prelude, not the main event. She was a territorial spirit, driven to action by the surge of power preceding the solstice. She was merely trying to clean up her territory before the true, devastating force arrived. He walked to the window. Oakhaven was quiet. The festive lights, which had looked so tired and anxious days ago, now looked utterly pointless, pathetic pinpricks of color against the overwhelming, oppressive blackness of the night sky. The town had chosen denial, and denial was about to make them easy prey. He no longer had the compendium of the wild hunt, the ultimate source of countermagic. He only had his memory and his cripplingly specific knowledge. The wild hunt ascendant. Elias spent the early hours of December 21st desperately trying to recall the compendium's final, most terrifying chapters. The wild hunt, Odin's hunt, or the German wilde Jagd, was not a single entity. It was a chaotic, elemental cavalcade. It was a procession of the dead, riding the sky on spectral horses and howling hounds, led by a fearsome figure, often Odin himself, or a dark, ancient goddess. Its purpose was simple: harvesting souls and spreading chaos. It was the embodiment of the season's raw, untamed terror. As the solstice morning dawned, Late, weak, and seemingly terrified of the approaching night, the harbingers began. First, the wind. It was unlike any wind Elias had ever experienced. It wasn't biting or blustering. It was a sudden, localized howl, sweeping through the maples that lined Oakhaven streets. It bent the trees nearly double, but left the surrounding valley completely still. It was a wind that felt deliberately ridden. Then the sound. Faint at first, a high-pitched, desperate yip-yip-yip that wasn't a dog, but an echo of a pack, spectral hounds. He strained his ears. It was coming from above the clouds. Elias grabbed his binoculars and rushed out onto his porch, pointing them toward the perpetually gray sky. He saw nothing but the bruised, low-hanging clouds. He remembered the lore. The sky shall be the hunting ground, and the moon shall be the quarry. He aimed the binoculars at the western horizon, where the sun was already preparing its reluctant descent. Not a single figure, but a massive, churning anomaly in the atmosphere. It was a dense, coiling mass of charcoal-black cloud moving with a speed and direction that defied all meteorological sense. It wasn't driven by prevailing currents. It was being directed. It was shaped less like a storm and more like a colossal, rapidly moving black wave. As the shadow of the cloud mass swept over the distant hills, Elias saw something else. A flash of movement riding the leading edge of the blackness. He caught it in his binoculars for a split second. Enormous skeletal hooves and the black silhouetted shape of a massive rider, cloaked and mounted, leading the terrifying charge. This was no hag seeking domestic redress. This was Yuletide terror at its zenith. The power of the longest night was not merely amplifying the magic, it was throwing open the main gates of winter's chaotic realm. Elias had defeated a scout, but now the entire army was descending, drawn by the raw magical energy released during the hag's violent banishment. The terror shifted completely, from the specific fear of punishment, Perchta, to the existential fear of annihilation, Odin, or the wild hunt. Elias retreated inside, locking the door. The chains he had heard earlier were merely a small link on the hag's rake. The chains he heard now were the endless, frantic harness and tackle of 1,000 spectral riders clattering across the roof of the sky. He had sacrificed the secret history for the town, only to discover that the sacrifice had merely cleared the way for the cosmic, devastating truth. He had to find a way to make Oakhaven survive the night, a night that was already proving to be the longest, most dangerous night in the town's 3-century history. Without his texts, he had to rely on the only magic the American Christmas truly understood, the desperate human will to survive until dawn. He checked his supplies, a shotgun, rock salt, and a desperate memory of a few key words from a burnt book. The longest night had begun, and the hunt was already at a full gallop.
Domesticity and dangerous spells. The spectral baying of the phantom hounds was no longer distant. It was a high, thin, terrifying sound that seemed to scrape against the very walls of Elias's cottage, signaling the imminent arrival of the wild hunt. The wind outside howled, but it was a calculating, inhuman sound, whipping around Oakhaven as though seeking the weak points in its collective soul. Elias, fresh from his sacrifice at Agnes Crofton's house, was in no state for a siege. His academic mind, stripped of its precious compendium, was forced into a terrifying, accelerated pragmatism. He couldn't fight a chaotic, elemental force with a shotgun. He had defeated the domestic witch with domestic countermagic, humility and honesty.
He had to fight the elemental hunt with elemental domestic protection. His kitchen became his sanctuary, and his ingredients his arsenal. This humble room, the nexus of warmth, sustenance, and the oldest human rituals, was now Elias Vance's kitchen coven. He began his frantic, whispered ritual, recalling scattered fragments of lore from centuries-old agrarian protection spells. Iron, fire, and the hearth. The wild hunt, led by Odin, was a pagan, chaotic force of wind and the dead. The traditional defense was always the same: iron and the hearth fire, the two markers of settled, Christianized civilization, anathema to the unholy cavalcade. Elias rushed to his wood stove. He threw in dry, splintered maple and lit it, ignoring the smoke alarm. He needed a boundary fire, a physical source of light and heat to repel the cold, traveling dead. He scrawled a crude, soot-covered odal rune, a symbol of home and inheritance, on the stove's iron door. Next, the iron. He yanked open his cupboards, grabbing every cast-iron pot, skillet, and trivet he owned. He placed them directly on the windowsills and floorboards, creating a haphazard perimeter of cold, heavy iron, the metal most abhorred by fey and chaotic entities. Dangerous spells, herbs, and spices. His spice rack, usually used for little more than weak coffee, became his apothecary of protection. He remembered the old Germanic belief that the hunt was searching for lost souls and could be appeased by tokens related to the home. He found a jar of oats, traditional feed for Odin's spectral horses. He scattered them thinly across the floor of the kitchen entrance, an offering to the beasts, a small sign of welcome to deflect the terror. More potently, he found dried bundles of rowan berries and juniper tucked away, relics from his student days. Rowan was the classic witch wood, a shield against evil magic, and juniper was used in northern purification rites. Elias tossed the rowan berries and juniper sprigs directly onto the raging fire in the wood stove. The combination was immediately toxic, the kitchen filled with a thick, blue-gray smoke, acrid and resinous, but powerfully protective. This was his dangerous spell, a purification smoke that would sicken the spectral riders and burn their ethereal lungs. The salt sigils. Working quickly, Elias grabbed a box of coarse kosher salt. Salt was the universal boundary, the purifier, and the ancient token of trust. He crawled along the floor, tracing thick protective lines along every window frame and door jamb. He didn't draw crosses, he drew Norse and Germanic sigils he remembered from the burning compendium, complex, interlocking knots and runes designed to confuse and repel. The salt line across the main door was the most critical. He drew a final, specific rune, the Algis rune, symbolizing divine protection and the defense of the self. He realized the true power of this magic. It was not academic, it was domesticity itself. The warmth of the fire, the taste of salt, the simple protection of iron, these were the things civilization had built against the primordial cold. The kitchen, armed with its ordinary tools, was the ultimate bulwark against the wild hunt's chaos. The collective coven. As the last of the salt was laid, Elias paused. He was safe, but the hunt was looking for many souls. His single pocket of resistance would not save the town. The hag's power had been broken by collective truth. The wild hunt's chaos must be repelled by collective domestic order. He grabbed his phone and called the two people who had already faced the magic: Mrs. Peterson, the gentle baker, and Agnes Crofton, the recovering weaver. He didn't explain the wild hunt. He explained duty and folklore. To Mrs. Peterson, whose gingerbread had been warped by the hag: "Mrs. Peterson, you must bake 3 loaves of simple, unsweetened bread. No sugar, no tinsel, just honest grain and water. Leave them on your porch before midnight. It is the old offering, the true offering to the winter spirits. It is vital for your safety." Mrs. Peterson, her faith in the mundane shattered by the incident with the gingerbread, simply whispered, "I understand, Dr. Vance. Honest bread." To Agnes Crofton, the reluctant heir of the hearthside, Agnes, you have an old metal shovel or a rake, something made of iron, near your woodshed. You must drag it to your hearth or place it on your windowsill and keep your fire lit. Do not stop until dawn. The iron must be visible. Agnes, still weak but resolute, confirmed. My grandfather's peat cutter. I'll get it. Elias hung up. The 3 nodes, the scholar's fortified kitchen, the baker's honest offering, and the weaver's iron hearth formed a makeshift coven of domesticity scattered across Oakhaven, fighting back with nothing more than ordinary ingredients and inherited belief. The clock struck 11:30 p.m. The longest night had begun. Outside, the baying crescendoed, no longer seeming to come from the sky, but from a point just beyond the perimeter of the cottage's protection. The juniper smoke was thick, the iron cold, and the fire roared, a tiny beacon of order against the incoming chaos. Elias stood in his kitchen, surrounded by pots and spices, the final line of defense against the terrors of the Yuletide.
When folklore enters the living room. The clock on Elias's stove read midnight. The longest night had officially begun. The instant the final minute dissolved, the baying outside transcended sound. It became a physical pressure, a vast, invisible hand pressing down on the roof of the cottage. The flames in the wood stove, Elias's protective hearth fire, roared suddenly, fighting the intense supernatural cold that instantly dropped the kitchen temperature by 20 degrees. Elias gripped his iron skillet, standing amidst his protective circle of salt and juniper smoke. He didn't have to see the wild hunt to know it was overhead. He could hear the thundering, chaotic gallop of spectral horses, the dry, rattling whisper of spectral chains, a sound distinct from the hag's slow drag, and, most horrifyingly, the deep, resonant, commanding voice of the hunt's leader, Odin's voice, a guttural, ancient sound that seemed to speak not to his ears, but directly to the oldest, most terrified part of his Puritan-infused soul. The purpose of the hunt was to harvest the exposed. The suburban homes of Oakhaven, built on denial and insulated by false cheer, were terrifyingly vulnerable. The living room breach. The folklore did not wait at the door. It entered the living room, violently. Elias's window offered a narrow view of his nearest neighbor, the Millers, a family whose Christmas display was a monument to synthetic joy, inflatable Santas, mechanized reindeer, and enough blinking LED lights to signal an aircraft. As the wild hunt descended, the chaos didn't breach the house through the chimney. It breached the facade. The Millers' massive inflatable Santa, a 15-foot beacon of consumer cheer, suddenly burst, not with a pop, but with a terrible moist scream. The mechanized reindeer spun faster and faster, their plastic limbs flailing and breaking, their internal music dissolving into a distorted, demonic caterwaul. Then came the true horror, the tinsel. Every strand of synthetic silver tinsel draped across the Miller's porch and windows, the very symbol of superficial, mass-produced cheer, began to visibly wither. It didn't melt, it turned black, curling into brittle dust-like strands of decay, smelling like burnt plastic and sulfur. The spectral hooves of the horses were ripping through the plastic garden gnomes, scattering their fragments like chaff. Folklore had entered the living room by tearing down the modern plastic camouflage. Suburban superstitions rise. Elias watched horrified as lights began turning on inside the Miller home. The family was not panicking, they were reverting. Logic had failed, and in the absence of reason, the oldest, most instinctive human survival mechanisms, superstitions, took over. He saw Mr. Miller, a man who had laughed at Elias's books, frantically pulling down every mirror in the living room. The dead and the spirits of the hunt can be trapped in reflections.
a completely forgotten primal superstition from the Middle Ages suddenly resurrected in a Connecticut colonial revival home. Mrs. Miller ran into the kitchen and began desperately wrapping red thread around the handle of her front door, a Mediterranean charm against the evil eye, a piece of fragmented ancestry she likely didn't even know she possessed. The town was enacting a kitchen coven of its own, but one based on panicked, disjointed memory, not calculated ritual. He received a frantic whispered call from the mayor, who was hiding in his basement. "Dr. Vance, the wreaths, they are on fire, but there is no flame. And my wife, she's forcing all the children to sleep with onions under their pillows. Why onions, Elias? Why onions?" "Protection against the night wanderers, Mayor," Elias muttered, loading his shotgun with rock salt shells. "It's an old Saxon remedy. It works. Tell her to keep going. Anything that smells strong and honest. Domesticity is your shield." The hunt, he realized, was actively seeking to lure people out. He could hear whispering in the wind outside his window, seductive, gentle promises. "Come out, little soul. We have gifts you truly deserve. Forget the debt. The world owes you comfort. Come." It was the ultimate temptation of the American lie, the promise of unearned reward, designed to pull the exhausted, guilt-ridden suburbanite from their protected hearth and into the chaos of the night sky. The coven holds. Elias checked in with his two protected nodes, the crucial members of his kitchen coven. He reached Mrs. Peterson first. Her line crackled, but her voice was steady. "It's loud, Dr. Vance. They are circling, but the bread worked. The spectral horses, they came down low. They ate the oats I left, and they paused at the 3 loaves of unsweetened bread. They took a bite from each. They respected the true labor, Elias. They won't cross the porch now. They are flying higher, frustrated." Mrs. Peterson's simple, honest offering, a token of work, not synthetic sweetness, had appealed to the archaic rules of the wild hunt, which respected true thrift and honest effort. Agnes Crofton's house was silent, but Elias knew she was safe behind her perimeter of iron and juniper smoke. In his own kitchen, the hunt's Hans, a pack of shadowy, whimpering forms, were trying to claw their way through his door, but they could not pass the salt sigil he had drawn on the floor. They would press against the wood, their spectral breath frosting the glass, and then retreat with pained whines, repelled by the strong scent of the burning juniper and the cold, unyielding barrier of iron. Elias stood his vigil, the chaos raging outside. The living rooms of Oakhaven were now ground zero for the collision of ancient pagan terror and modern denial. The suburban facade was melting away, revealing the terrified, instinctively superstitious humans underneath. He had managed to give them a fighting chance, not with magic wands or ancient scrolls, but with the power of ordinary pots, salt, and the rediscovered terrifying superstitions of the hearth. He knew the hunt would not leave until the solstice passed. He had hours to go. He had to keep the fire hot and the fear contained. A curse wrapped in festive paper. The longest night was proving to be a ruthless, unending test of will. It was 3 a.m., and Elias Vance was operating on pure adrenaline and the acrid smell of burning juniper. His kitchen coven had held. The spectral hounds whined at the salt lines, refusing the iron, and the spectral riders, sensing the organized domestic resistance, had shifted tactics. Brute chaos had failed. Now the wild hunt resorted to its most insidious weapon, temptation. The high, chaotic howling of Odin's cavalcade began to dissolve into localized, seductive whispers directed at individual homes. The voice was no longer demanding souls, it was offering wishes. "Your debt is too high. We forgive it. Just reach out." They will never know the truth about what you did. We will erase it. Come to the window. This was the core of the American lie weaponized, the promise of an unearned reward that nullified effort and absolved guilt. Then the physical manifestation appeared. The unsettling gifts. Elias heard a quiet, unsettling thud from his own porch, a sound completely unlike the scraping chains or galloping hooves. It was the sound of a package being set down. He crept to the window, peering past the juniper smoke and the thick salt sigil. On his porch, nestled beside a dusty iron skillet, was a small, perfectly square box. It was wrapped in heavy, metallic red paper, the exact shade of festive commercialism, and tied with an elaborate gold-flocked bow. It was utterly, terrifyingly out of place. It was the unsettling gift. A curse wrapped in festive paper. The gift was not for him. The hunt knew his desire was the burned compendium, and that was already sacrificed. This was a psychological probe, a generalized lure for the neighborhood. He watched through the window as the phenomenon repeated itself across Oak Hazen. Small jewel-toned packages materialized on doorsteps, beneath porch lights, and on snow-covered mailboxes, always perfectly placed, always perfectly wrapped. He received a frantic, terrified call from the man across the street, Mr. Henderson, a middle management worker known for his crushing credit card debt, an obsessive envy of his neighbor's luxury car. "Elias, there's a box. It's beautiful. It's vibrating, and I hear a noise inside, like keys jangling." Mr. Henderson's voice was wet with terror and desperate hope. "It feels like relief. It feels like the answer." I yelled into the phone, "Do not touch it! Henderson, listen to me! That is the hunt's lure. It's an illusion. It's what you didn't earn. That is the debt collector, not Santa Claus. If you open it, you accept the unearned reward, and you belong to them." The connection dissolved into static, followed by a sudden, chilling burst of synthetic Christmas music, the jingle bell sound of a million tiny mocking bells orchestrated by the spectral riders. The most dangerous call came from Mayor Hayes, the political cheerleader who had ridiculed Elias. Mayor Hayes had always coveted power and prestige, masking a crippling fear of political disgrace. "Vance, they're everywhere. But on my desk, there's one box. It's glowing. It's whispering my name." The mayor was sobbing. "It says, a clean slate. It says, the secret history erased. It's the folder, Elias, the one that contains the evidence of the embezzlement from 5 years ago, the one that would ruin my career. It's wrapped. If I open it, the contents are mine, gone forever. A clean, unearned life. The debt is paid." This was the ultimate psychological trap tailored for the suburban superstition, the belief that problems could be solved instantly, without effort or honesty, through some magical capitalist intervention. The festive paper was the perfect camouflage for the magical curse. Elias, relying only on the remembered logic of his lost compendium, countered desperately. "Mayor, the hag's master is the weaver of unpaid debts. The gift is the final bill. Opening it is the payment. You must resist the lie. Go to your kitchen. Find the oldest, most honest thing, a broken tool, a tarnished silver spoon, and place it next to the gift. Offer the earned item against the unearned item." The mayor choked out a sob. I have a ladle, a terrible bent ladle my grandmother used. It's honest, Elias. It's honest work. Use it. Put it next to the box, and pray to the oldest part of yourself." Elias heard the connection drop, leaving him alone in the juniper-smoked kitchen, shivering, knowing that the mayor's fate, and perhaps the town's, hinged on a tarnished ladle against a magically wrapped promise of easy absolution. The retreat. The final hour of the solstice approached. The exhaustion was a physical weight on Elias's chest. The specters of the hunt were circling his cottage again, lower this time, their spectral hooves scraping the roof shingles. But something was changing. The whispers began to sound strained, brittle, and angry. The furious, chaotic energy that had sustained the hunt was weakening. The sun, though still far below the horizon, was beginning to exert its slow, inevitable return. The longest night was yielding. With a final, terrifying roar that split the air, the entire wild hunt suddenly ascended. It wasn't a retreat, it was an abrupt, angry withdrawal. The chaotic black cloud Elias had seen earlier coiled inward, shrinking rapidly, gathering up the spectral riders and hounds and vanishing back into the pre-dawn atmosphere with the sound of tearing silk. Silence. Absolute terrifying silence. He waited until the first weak blue-gray light of dawn touched the snow outside. He stumbled to his porch. The atmosphere was clean, cold, and still. The iron skillet remained. The unsalted gruel was a frozen lump. The unsettling gift, the perfectly wrapped red box, was gone. It had winked out of existence at the exact moment the magical protection of the solstice ended. The town was safe, for now. He had fought the temptation of the lie and won. But the psychological cost was enormous. He knew that across Oak Haven, dozens of people had stood at the brink, fighting the temptation of the curse wrapped in festive paper. The physical storm was over, but the psychological superstitions of easy reward and avoidance of debt would linger long after the sun rose.
A warning ignored at the winter solstice. The morning of December 22nd was silent. The sun, finally dominant after the longest night, cast a feeble, crystalline light over Oak Haven. The chaos of the wild hunt was gone, replaced by a profound, shell-shocked stillness. Elias Vance stood in his kitchen, his head throbbing, the scent of juniper smoke still sharp in the air. He was alive, the salt lines were intact, and his self-built kitchen coven had held. But his victory felt brittle. He found a package on his porch, not a beautifully cursed gift, but a simple, broken tool. Mayor Hayes's tarnished, bent ladle. It was a silent admission of the mayor's desperate struggle against the curse wrapped in festive paper, and a testament to the power of the honest, ugly truth. Elias left it on his hearth, honoring the mayor's secret fight. The town, however, was already deep into denial. By 10 a.m., the official narrative had coalesced. Quote, severe, localized microburst wind event, system-wide power failure, and unauthorized use of fireworks in the suburbs. End quote. The townsfolk, traumatized but unwilling to admit the failure of their modern material world, desperately clung to the rational lie. The mirror motif. Elias knew the truth couldn't be so easily buried. The hag's initial magic, judgment, and the wild hunt's chaotic passage had left behind a powerful, insidious residual effect. The fractured reflection. He drove through town, ignoring the police tape and the official narrative, observing the damage. The synthetic snow and tinsel had melted and decayed, but the most unsettling damage was to the glass. Every home that had been aggressively targeted by the hunt, and every piece of glass that had been left uncovered now bore a supernatural scar. The large, decorative picture windows were not shattered, but were covered in a dense, shimmering fog that couldn't be wiped away. Automobile windshields had hairline fractures that snaked across the surface in impossible patterns. The interior mirrors, especially in the living rooms of the most aggressively cheerful houses, were worse. They were not broken, but distorted.
The glass surfaces were concave or convex, creating funhouse reflections that were deeply unsettling. This was no accident. This was the misfortune, a physical manifestation of the psychic breach. Elias remembered the ancient Germanic superstition. Mirrors capture the soul of the dead and can be used by malicious spirits to project lies. The town, in its panicked, superstitious reaction to the hunt, had remembered to cover some of its reflective surfaces, leaving the hag's residual, judgmental magic free to settle into the glass. The lingering judgment. He stopped at the house of the Millers, the family whose inflatable Santa had screamed. Mr. Miller was struggling to wipe down his living room mirror. "It won't come clean, Dr. Vance. It's like the glass itself is diseased." Mr. Miller was haggard, his face ashen with exhaustion and lingering fear. Elias looked at the mirror. Mr. Miller's reflection was horribly elongated and thin, his features twisted into a mask of perpetual anxiety. But as Elias watched, he saw a flickering moment where the reflection changed. Mr. Miller saw himself not as a respected manager, but as a small, furtive man pocketing change. The hag's judgment, the revelation of unpaid moral debts, was still trapped in the glass, forcing the viewer to confront their deepest, smallest shames. Elias hurried to his phone and called Sheriff Brody, who was clearing debris downtown. "Sheriff, listen to me. The danger isn't over. The mirrors are corrupted. They are reflecting the spiritual death that the hag came to collect. They are an amplifier, a warning. Tell the town to cover every mirror and reflective surface immediately. Do not look into them until the new year. It's an ancient rule of purification." The sheriff sighed, the sound loud and tired over the phone. "Dr. Vance, the only thing they're reflecting is a bad case of the flu and a whole lot of insurance claims. This is not a horror movie. We're getting the power restored. You need to sleep." The sheriff's dismissal was the final piece of the curse, a warning ignored. The misfortune strikes. The inevitable consequence came that afternoon. It struck not a criminal, but Mrs. Eloise Henderson, the matriarch of the family whose husband had been tempted by the keys in the cursed gift. Mrs. Henderson was a notoriously competitive collector of antique porcelain dolls. She had spent the morning cleaning her most prized possession, a flawless 18th century porcelain doll known as the Duchess, valued at over $20,000. She was cleaning it in front of a bathroom mirror she had neglected to cover. The mirror now, warped and hazy from the solstice breach, showed her reflection, but it also showed the doll in her hand. And for a moment, the doll's reflection was grotesque, its features twisted in a silent accusatory scream. A sudden, uncontrolled tremor, a localized psychic backlash hit Mrs. Henderson. The doll slipped from her grasp and shattered on the tile floor, destroyed utterly. It was not a random accident. It was a precise, targeted misfortune, a punishment for her competitive vanity and the lingering atmosphere of debt in her home, amplified by the breached reflective surface. It was a loss that was personal, emotional, and public, utterly shattering her carefully constructed suburban life. The town did not see a consequence of magic. They saw a nervous breakdown. But Elias, standing in his juniper-scented kitchen, knew the truth. The hag had been banished, but the mirror of Oak Haven's deep, pervasive denial, the refusal to acknowledge the true price of the season, was still reflecting their guilt and delivering misfortune. The town had ignored the warning that the solstice brought, and now they were left to deal with the slow, agonizing punishment of seeing their true, ugly reflections until the purifying power of the new year arrived.
The witch's presence felt in small-town America. The town's desperate need for order peaked at 2 p.m. Mayor Hayes, shaken but resolute in his political duty, called an emergency assembly at the community center located directly on Main Street. The official purpose was to coordinate the wind damage cleanup and ensure the Christmas Eve festivities proceeded on schedule. The true, unspoken purpose was to collectively reinforce the official lie. It was just a storm. There are no witches. The entire town converged on Main Street, a tight, anxious cluster of humanity seeking the reassurance of community and commerce. But the moment they gathered in public, the lingering punitive magic that Elias had contained in their homes began to bleed out, drawn by the density of their collective suppressed guilt. The hag's presence, the residual magical contamination of the weaver of unpaid debts, and the chaotic psychic energy of the wild hunt was no longer confined to the shadows. It was felt by every man, woman, and child. The corruption of the square. Main Street, Oak Haven's meticulously preserved colonial heart, became the central stage for the escalating haunting. The first public symbol to crumble was the massive 50-foot spruce that served as the town's communal Christmas tree. It stood in the center of the square, draped in thousands of lights. As Mayor Hayes began his speech about Oak Haven's resilience, a shudder ran through the tree. Immediately, the lights did not short out, they shifted. The usual warm white and festive red colors vanished, replaced by a ghastly flickering yellow and sickening green, the colors of decay and contagion. Then came the visible sign of the hag's revenge on superficial cheer. The needles of the spruce began to fall, not slowly, but in thick, continuous showers, turning the snow around the base black. It was a rapid, accelerated decay that mirrored the spiritual rot the hag had come to punish. By the time the mayor reached the word cleanup, the magnificent tree was a skeleton of dark, diseased branches. Time and truth break down. The haunting intensified, attacking the very structure of the town's civic order. Above the old Oak Haven Bank building, the grand colonial clock, a symbol of reliable American time, began to whine. Its minute hand jumped violently, then stopped. Then, with a loud mechanical clang, it began to spin backward at a dizzying pace. Time itself was unraveling, returning the town to the chaotic, pre-Christian, unruled cycle the hag represented. Inside Mrs. Peterson's ornament shop, visible through the large plate glass window, the effect of the distorted mirrors from the solstice night was amplified. The porcelain dolls and hand-painted ornaments on display now seemed to be facing the town gathering, their painted faces twisted into identical expressions of silent, weeping agony. The town was suddenly seeing its own shame reflected, not just in mirrors, but in its commercial symbols. This was the witch's presence made public, a pervasive, inescapable atmosphere of judgment and decay that corroded every synthetic symbol of the holiday. The public misfortune. Mayor Hayes, sweating profusely beneath the ruined spruce, was trying to pivot the crowd's attention from the clock to a new festive banner. "We will persevere. We will move forward. The spirit of Oak Haven is—" He paused, adjusting his tie. His eyes flickered to the highly polished brass dedication plaque mounted on the community center wall behind him. The plaque was so shiny, it served as a perfect improvised mirror. In that instant, every person close enough saw it. Mayor Hayes's reflection in the plaque was not just distorted, it was overlaid with an image of a small, frightened man furtively signing a document. A clear, brief vision of his long-suppressed political shame. The hag's power, amplified by the public setting, had forced a moment of public revelation. As a collective gasp rippled through the crowd, a focused, unnatural gust of wind, a last desperate exhale of the wild hunt, whipped down Main Street. It tore down the festive banner the mayor was trying to highlight, revealing the drab, weather-worn sign beneath it. 1903. Fundraiser for the town waterworks. Debt remains unpaid. The haunting of Main Street was complete. It was a precise, targeted attack on the town's greatest collective lie, that their community was built on virtue, not on suppressed debt and denial. The witch's presence was felt as the unescapable physical manifestation of their moral ledger. The crowd, their denial shattered, dissolved into terrified murmurs and scattered fights, accusing each other of past slights, minor thefts, and long-held grudges. They were consumed by the localized chaos the witch had instilled. Elias's final stand. Elias, watching the collapse of the social order from the edge of the square, knew that he had been wrong. He thought the hag was banished. She was merely dormant, having left behind a powerful self-sustaining spell of judgment. The hag's influence was now the town's atmosphere. The logical intellectual solution, the compendium, was gone. The personal domestic solution, the kitchen coven, was only a shield. To stop the public haunting, he needed an act of public, selfless redemption. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the single untainted item left from his ordeal. The small ancient gold coin left by the nascent Bafana, the rewarding aspect of the hag, on Agnes Crofton's hearth. This coin represented the opposite of the town's guilt and the hag's judgment. It was the only pure, earned item of true folklore left. He had to use it, not to save himself, but to purify the center of the curse. Elias walked toward the decimated Christmas tree, the center of the corruption. He ignored the shrieking wind and the chaotic crowd. He had to perform a final, visible, public ritual, a sacrifice of the last pure relic of the shadow world to cleanse Main Street and finally banish the lingering judgment of the winter hag.
Arming against the old ways. The gold coin in Elias's palm was cold, yet it radiated a faint, untainted warmth, the essence of earned reward, the antithesis of the hag's debt and the wild hunt's unearned lure. This single artifact, a gift from the good side of the banished winter hag, La Befana, was his only weapon against the pervasive aura of decay and guilt that afflicted Main Street. But the coin alone was a charm. It wasn't an anchor. The haunting was a wide-area spell of corruption, demanding a larger, ritualistic countermeasure. Elias's mind, stripped of his academic arrogance, relied on the raw, fundamental principles of folklore. To contain and purify the public space, he needed two elements universally feared by malicious spirits in the old ways: salt and steel. Salt for purification, boundary drawing, and warding off ill will. Steel or iron for protection against the fey and all things unholy, a symbol of human craft and vigilance. Gathering the salt. The town square was a tableau of chaos. People were fighting over spilled goods, their faces twisted by the lingering judgment reflected in the shattered windows. Elias pushed through the frenzied crowd, ignoring the accusations hurled at him. It's his books. He brought it here. He needed a large, pure quantity of salt, not table salt, which was too fine and too associated with domestic seasoning, but rock salt, the coarser industrial substance used to melt the ice of winter, a symbol of human order against natural chaos. The only reliable source was Old Man Hemlock's Hardware, 2 blocks down Main Street. Elias burst into the store. Old Man Hemlock, a grizzled man who had always scoffed at Elias's fairy tales, was sitting behind the counter, clutching a tarnished silver cross. "Hemlock, I need all your rock salt, the coarse stuff, the heavy bags." Hemlock's eyes were wide with terror, reflecting the yellow-green flickering from the ruined spruce outside. "The ground's frozen solid, Doc. It won't melt the ice now." "It's not for the ice, Hemlock. It's for the boundary. It's for purification. The debt collector is still here. Do you want her back in your mirrors?" The sheer conviction in Elias's voice, combined with the obvious magical collapse outside, broke the old man's denial. Hemlock stumbled back and pointed a trembling finger to the back room. Elias retrieved 2 heavy, 50-pound bags of coarse white rock salt.
clumsy, ordinary tools to fight an extraordinary enemy. The weight felt reassuring. This was the solid, honest labor that the hag respected. Gathering the steel. Next, steel, or preferably wrought iron. It had to be a significant piece, consecrated by human labor and visible against the sky, a symbol of protection and defiance against the chaos of the wild hunt's leader, Odin, who often associated with the air. Elias immediately thought of the weather vane atop the old town hall, a beautiful, massive piece of colonial-era wrought iron shaped like a defiant rooster. The rooster, a creature of dawn and vigilance, was the perfect foil to the nocturnal terror of the winter hag. He ran back to the community center, where he found Sheriff Brody sitting stunned amidst the debris, his denial finally shattered by the sight of the ruined Christmas tree and the hysterical crowd. "Sheriff, you've seen the truth now. The mirrors, the debt sign, the tree. This is the hag's lingering presence. It's a localized spell of self-destruction. I need the weather vane from the town hall roof, now!" Sheriff looked at the scholar, not with contempt, but with dead-eyed, exhausted acceptance. "The roof hatch is sealed. I need a ladder crew." "There is no time. The corruption is accelerating." He pointed to the sky, where a few carrion birds were circling the ruined spruce. "The hag is calling her scavengers. We need an anchor. The wrought iron rooster. It is a symbol of daybreak and protection." Sheriff, realizing the absurdity of his badge against magic, finally nodded. He grabbed a crowbar. "It's 3 stories up. Let's go arm against the old ways." They fought their way through the collapsing building and up the dusty, treacherous fire escape. Brody, surprisingly agile, used the crowbar to force the roof hatch. The climb was perilous, the wind cold and residual magic making the metal slick. On the roof, Elias worked fast. The rooster was heavy, anchored to a thick rod. Brody used the crowbar to pry it loose from its base. The final screeching tear of old steel against old wood was a triumphant sound, a final act of human labor claiming dominion over the ancient, untamed world. The final approach. Elias returned to the center of Main Street, bent double under the weight of the 2 50-pound bags of rock salt, the heavy wrought iron rooster cradled precariously under one arm. The chaos around the Christmas tree was absolute. A small fire had started beneath the ruined brows, likely from a broken wire, a chaotic, uncontrolled hearth that threatened to spread the destruction. He threw down the bags. The impact scattered the coarse salt over the black, sodden snow. He frantically worked to tear open the bags and began to draw a massive, perfect circle around the diseased tree, a salt boundary, purifying the contaminated public space. He needed to contain the magic. The salt circle was the barrier. The wrought iron rooster was the anchor of domestic protection. And the gold coin was the sacrifice of honesty needed to break the lingering spell. He looked at the dying tree, the symbol of the town's forced, dishonest cheer. He positioned the heavy iron rooster at the base of the trunk, the bird's head facing east towards the coming dawn. Elias knelt in the center of the circle, pulling the gold coin from his pocket. The final ritual of the old ways was about to begin, and he was the only one left to perform it. He was armed with salt and steel, ready to sacrifice the last piece of pure folklore to save a town that still insisted it was only a very bad storm.
Following the trail of icy footprints. The town square was a tableau of contained anarchy, held together only by the frantic, shouted commands of Sheriff Brody and the desperate, newly humbled efficiency of Mayor Hayes. They had finally faced the truth, and the truth demanded action. All through the evening of December 22nd, Elias worked,
organizing the town's debris into a final ritualistic defense. The final act of counter-magic had to be timed precisely to the deepest night, midnight. At 11:50 p.m., the atmosphere in the square was suffocating, the oppressive silence of fear only broken by the occasional fearful cry of a townsperson unable to sleep. Elias stood at the center of the square, surrounded by the three men who now believed him, the sheriff, the mayor, and Old Man Hemlock, who was guarding the remaining rock salt. The ritual of salt and steel. As the clock began its final slow chimes toward midnight, Elias began the ritual. He used the entire contents of the 2 50-pound bags of rock salt to trace a massive, gleaming white circle around the ruined spruce, a colossal boundary designed to contain and neutralize the lingering corruption. The pure salt hissed faintly as it met the magically tainted snow. At the base of the decaying tree, he placed the heavy wrought-iron rooster, its symbolic head pointed east. Steel, the power of human craft and vigilance, was anchored against the tree of shame. Finally, he knelt. He held the single gold coin aloft, catching the faint light of the moon. This was the most difficult act. This one coin, the only tangible proof of the hag's dual nature, was the sacrifice of the last remaining truth. We offer you the pure payment, the earned reward that Oakhaven failed to provide. We trade the lie of abundance for this single honest coin. Judgment is finished, the debt is paid. Begone, weaver of unpaid debts, and return to the cycle of both reward and ruin. With a final desperate heave of will, he thrust the small cold coin into the frozen earth beneath the iron rooster. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. The ruined spruce, which had been flickering with the sick green and yellow light of decay, suddenly went dark. The deep, oppressive sense of self-judgment that had gripped Main Street instantly lifted, replaced by a sudden, normal, biting winter cold. The air tasted clean, like freshly turned earth and snow. The corruption was banished. The haunting of Main Street was over. The sheriff and the mayor stood slack-jawed, staring at the now silent square. Elias, as he rose, exhausted but triumphant, the sheriff pointed a trembling finger toward the base of the defunct town clock, the very spot where time itself had started to run backward. Elias, look at the salt. Where the corruption had been most concentrated, the rock salt had not melted the snow. Instead, the rock salt had hardened it, encasing the area in a shell of pure ice. And pressed deeply into that fresh, clear ice were undeniable physical marks. Footprints. They were large, heavy, and strangely archaic, leaving deep impressions of a bipedal stride. But the most chilling detail was the shape of the heel, long, elongated, and ending in a faintly cloven point. Perta, Elias whispered, recognizing the telltale sign of the alpine hag's demonic heel. She didn't just leave. She was physically here, contained by the chaos. The hag had manifested fully enough to leave a physical, tangible trail. This was the midnight hunt, a localized physical pursuit. Elias, the sheriff, and the mayor, armed with a powerful electric lantern, began following the trail of icy footprints. The tracks led directly away from the purified town square. They bypassed the protected domestic homes of the Kitchen Coven, Mrs. Peterson's, Agnes Crofton's, and cut a direct, relentless path out of the commercial district. The prints were clear and unmistakable, frozen into the ice, moving with surprising speed. They led past the edge of Oakhaven, past the last gas station and the final suburban cul-de-sac into the oldest, most ignored sector of the town. The trail did not lead to the woods. It led to the wrought iron gates of the Oakhaven Colonial Cemetery, the oldest burial ground in the county. Elias stopped at the gates, his blood turning to ice despite the cold. He looked down at the last clearest print, which had marred the surface of a moss-covered granite headstone. The final piece of the hag's plan clicked into place. The reckoning on St. Stephen's Day, December 26th, was still the deadline. The judgment wasn't just for the living, Elias muttered, his voice ragged. Perta is also associated with the souls of the dead, specifically those who were unclean or unbaptized. She comes to judge the moral state of the entire community, living and dead. The hag's physical manifestation had not been banished. It had simply been diverted from the living by the purity of the ritual. The trail of icy footprints led not to her disappearance, but to her final, terrifying goal, the corruption of the dead. If the hag could claim the souls of the long-gone residents of Oakhaven before Christmas, she could anchor her terror permanently in the soil, damning the entire town. Elias looked at the sheriff and the mayor. She's not just judging the living. She's coming for the ancestors buried beneath Oakhaven. We stopped the haunting of Main Street, but now we have to fight for the souls buried beneath Oakhaven. The midnight hunt had led them to a far deeper, more ancient battle.
Understanding the witch's motive. The trail of the hag's icy footprints stopped at the wrought iron fence of the Oakhaven Colonial Cemetery, but her presence was palpable inside. The air was not just cold, it was dead cold, lacking the vibrant, living chill of a normal winter night. Elias squinted into the gloom. The icy tracks led directly to the oldest section of the burial ground, the crumbling slate headstones dating back to the 1680s. The hag was here, doing her final, terrible work. He pointed to the ground near a massive moss-covered monument dedicated to the town's founders. The earth was subtly stirring, not from wind, but from an internal tremor. A faint, sickening greenish glow, like corrupted phosphorus, emanated from the newly disturbed soil. "She's not just judging the living," Elias whispered, pulling his coat tight. "She's harvesting the unfulfilled contract. The reckoning on St. Stephen's Day isn't just a deadline for us. It's the deadline for the corrupted souls buried here. A covenant of shame." Elias's mind raced through the fragments of his burned compendium, the forbidden chapters dealing with colonial-era folk pacts. The hag's motive was now terrifyingly clear. She wasn't simply a random malicious spirit. She was an ancient figure of order and contract, fulfilling an old dark covenant. The colonial Puritans, obsessed with moral purity and the fear of the unclean dead, often made desperate, secret bargains in the face of insurmountable adversity, such as plague or devastating crop failure. They feared that if their dead were impure, their very land would be cursed. Elias remembered a specific, obscure reference, a whisper of local shame that the founding elders of Oakhaven had buried deep in the historical record. It wasn't a random storm that brought her here, Elias explained, his voice hollow. It was a pact with the darkness. Centuries ago, during the first devastating winter, when the crops failed and a fever swept the town, the founders, the ancestors of the people who built that denial-laden Main Street, made a trade. He looked directly at Mayor Hayes, whose family traced its lineage back to the 17th century founders. They promised the hag, Perta, the weaver of unpaid debts, a guarantee. Their community would survive and thrive, but in exchange, the hag would have the right to claim the souls of the dead who died unclean, or those whose debts, moral or financial, remained outstanding by the midwinter reckoning. The witch's motive was a horrific, legally binding contract.
The town's entire history, the aggressively false cheer, the suppressed debt, the constant denial of failure was not merely a modern flaw, it was a continuation of the founding lie. By maintaining the illusion of perfection, the living kept their ancestors' ledgers perpetually unpaid and impure, thereby maintaining the hag's right to claim their souls under the original pact. The witch's initial appearance, the spinning wheel and the mirrors, was a pre-assessment. She saw the town's denial and knew the conditions of the pact were met. She came to claim her payment, the permanent corruption of Oakhaven's spiritual foundation. If the hag could bind the souls of the founders and claim the cemetery before St. Stephen's Day, December 26th, her terror would be permanently anchored to the physical location. The entire town would become eternally beholden to the weaver of unpaid debts. The final counter-motive. The task shifted from fighting a monster to voiding a contract. You cannot shoot a legal agreement. We can't fight her with iron or salt here. We must fight her with truth and redemption. We must nullify the ancient dishonest terms of the pact. The only way to void a covenant based on moral uncleanliness was to perform an act of supreme, undeniable historical honesty that purified the original lie. They had to expose the founding shame and redeem the debt that was holding the ancestors hostage. What was the source of the debt? The fear of the unclean death. The physical symbol of the original agreement, the document that records the founding intent and the town's first resources, is the key. Mayor Hayes, his political arrogance replaced by ancestral fear, suddenly gasped. "The original town charter," he whispered, his eyes wide. "It's in the sealed archives in the old town hall basement, signed by the founding elders, detailing the resources spent during that first hard winter. It's the physical record of the debt that they were so afraid of." Elias realized the true final sacrifice. He had sacrificed his personal obsession, the compendium. The town had sacrificed its domestic lie, the tinsel. Now they had to sacrifice their historical lie. "We retrieve the charter," Elias commanded. "We must bring the original historical lie to this cemetery before these specific graves and perform a final profound act of redemption and truth. We must break the pact for the dead before the hag finishes her work." The three men, the scholar, the enforcer, and the politician, looked at the faintly glowing corrupted earth. The hag's work was accelerating. The final confrontation would not be a battle of magic, but a battle of historical honesty against an ancient, corrupted legal contract. They had to break the lie that founded Oakhaven.
Logic versus lore in a snow-covered world. The short journey from the colonial cemetery to the Oakhaven Town Hall was the most surreal experience of Elias Vance's life. He was riding in a sheriff's car, flanked by a lawman and a mayor, all three of them unified in the shared absurd mission of retrieving an antique document to save the souls of 300-year-old Puritan Deg from a folkloric alpine witch. This was the battle for belief, the confrontation between the empirical certainty of the modern world, logic, and the absolute, terrifying truth of lore. Mayor Hayes, his face pale and set, articulated the cognitive dissonance that afflicted them all. "I just authorized the use of city resources to retrieve a historical document to fight a spell. My entire career is based on quantifiable data and balanced budgets. This is insane, Elias." "It is," Elias agreed, gripping the handle of the wrought-iron rooster he had brought along as their anchor. "The logic of bureaucracy failed you. The logic of our tax dollars failed you. The hag thrives in the gaps where your logic insists she cannot exist. Tonight, our only weapon is lore. Our only defense is the willingness to believe the unbelievable." The snow-covered world outside was pristine, silent,
and vast, the perfect isolating canvas for a fight that had nothing to do with physics or law, and everything to do with belief. Retrieving the lie. The town hall, the site of the previous week's chaos, was dark and locked down. They entered through a side door, using the mayor's key and the sheriff's bolt cutters, a perfect synthesis of modern authority and necessary violation. The archives were in the sub-basement, sealed behind a modern steel door and climate control units. This room was the heart of the town's logic, a repository of facts, figures, and official history. As they descended, the air grew heavy, thick with the silence of suppressed guilt. The room wasn't actively corrupted like the square, but it was powerfully resistant. The digital lock on the archive door failed 3 times before the sheriff, using the cold, simple logic of steel, a heavy-duty crowbar, pried it open. Inside, the archives were sterile, cool, and lined with metal shelving. Mayor Hayes led them to the oldest, most tightly secured vault, the Founder's Box. As the mayor pulled out the antique, leather-bound, original town charter, the battle for his belief reached its climax. The document was brittle, sealed with wax, and covered in the cramped, archaic script of his 17th century ancestor. The mayor held the charter up to the beam of the sheriff's flashlight. Elias saw the mayor's eyes widen, not just in recognition, but in profound shame. The charter wasn't just a record of boundaries. It was riddled with archaic language referencing the due accounting and the requirement for clean hands when petitioning for civic aid, echoes of the hag's demand for honesty and purity. The logic we use to run this town is a lie. My ancestor didn't just found the town, he put a lien on it. He codified the hag's demands into our earliest laws to save his own skin. The entire place is built on a corrupted contract. The mayor's final, full acceptance of the lore was the turning point. The physical object, the charter, the tangible proof of the founding lie, was now armed and ready. The final sacrifice of logic. They returned to the cemetery. The sight was worse. The greenish glow was now radiating fiercely from a single, low-lying, unmarked slate grave in the founder's plot. The hag was finishing her work, using the cover of the longest night's subsequent darkness. Elias directed them to the grave of the town's first, most dishonest elder, the one whose name was whispered in the oldest documents as the architect of the pact. We fight her not with steel on this grave, but with unblemished truth, Elias said, his voice firm. We void the contract by making a public, sacrificial declaration that the original terms were based on a lie. He quickly drew a small, final salt circle around the glowing grave. The pure white of the salt hissed against the corrupt green light. He handed the wrought iron rooster to Sheriff Brody. Anchor of vigilance, keep the dead contained within this circle. The hag respects the boundaries of iron. He turned to Mayor Hayes. You must offer the charter. You must speak the truth, publicly, in the name of your ancestors, against the logic that dictated this lie for centuries. Mayor Hayes, trembling but resolute, knelt by the grave. He held the original town charter over the faintly glowing earth, the culmination of the battle for belief. In the name of the living people of Oakhaven, we acknowledge the historical debt and the lie of our founding. We accept the shame. The contract for unclean souls is void. We trade the false logic of the past for the true lore of redemption. As he finished, he didn't burn the charter. He performed a far more potent ritual. He gently laid the document onto the grave, pulling out a permanent marker and slowly, deliberately, drawing a large, powerful cross over the founders' names, an act of final, ritualistic purification over the original lie. The reaction was cataclysmic. A guttural shriek tore through the silence of the cemetery, the sound of an ancient contract being violently broken. The greenish glow from the grave flared with impossible brightness, then violently extinguished itself. The pressure lifted completely. The air was merely cold, and the only sound was the wind gently swirling the snow-covered world. The hag's final, devastating move had been countered not by magic, but by a mayor's public sacrificial acceptance of shame. The battle was over.
A moment of winter silence. The great guttural shriek that tore through the colonial cemetery was not the sound of a spirit in agony, but the sound of an ancient binding contract violently shredded. The greenish glow emanating from the founder's grave, which had represented the codified moral debt of Oakhaven, flared one last time. It was a searing emerald light that illuminated the startled snow-covered gravestones and the three exhausted men. Then, with a sound like a window shattering in a void, the light extinguished. The sudden absolute silence that followed was terrifying in its completeness. The whipping wind died. The creaking of the ancient oaks stopped. The distant, high-pitched whine of the residual magical energy that had plagued Oakhaven for days vanished. It was a profound, instantaneous moment of winter silence. Elias Vance, kneeling beside the grave, felt the cold air rush back in, no longer carrying the acrid scent of decay or the psychic pressure of guilt. It was merely clean, crisp air. The spell was broken. The aftermath of truth. Mayor Hayes stood frozen, his hand still resting on the original town charter, which lay on the grave, now marked with the bold, permanent cross of redemption. The lie that had governed his town, his family, and his career was exposed and sacrificed. He looked at the charter, then at the empty, silent air, and collapsed onto the snow, weeping from relief and shame. His ordeal was over, but the reckoning of his own internal logic versus lore had just begun. Sheriff Brody, the anchor of steel in his hand, the wrought iron rooster, slowly lowered the heavy iron. He looked at Elias, his expression a mixture of reverence and utter bewilderment. He had spent his life enforcing the laws of the town. Now he had participated in the ritualistic voiding of its founding law. Did we just save the dead? Brody whispered, the cold reality of the night finally hitting him. We redeemed the town's integrity, Elias corrected, rising stiffly. His own body felt like a drained battery, but his mind was clear for the first time since he sacrificed his compendium. The hag was a creature of contract. We satisfied the debt not with money, but with the truth, the ultimate currency of her sister, La Befana. The greenish tinge was gone from the graves. The frozen footprints of the hag were still visible in the path, but they were now inert, mere marks in the ice, no longer conduits of residual magic. A silence of renewal. The silence was not empty, it was pregnant with possibility. It was the sound of a fresh start, a rare moment when the chaotic noise of both the modern world and the ancient supernatural realm paused. Elias walked slowly to the cemetery gates, looking out at the distant scattered lights of Oakhaven. The town was still. They were sleeping off the combined trauma of the wild hunt and the public shame of Main Street, unaware that their spiritual foundation had just been restored. He noted a subtle yet significant physical change. The snow-covered world suddenly looked different. The blue-white snow crystals, which had earlier seemed to absorb the light, now reflected it, sharp and brilliant.
The stars, obscured by the psychic smog of the hag's influence, now shone with impossible clarity above the black silhouettes of the winter trees. The atmosphere was clean. The spell was truly broken. Elias returned to the grave and helped the mayor and sheriff to their feet. He told them what their next, final duty was. They had to face the morning not with a new lie, but with the difficult, honest truth. The haunting is over, but the people will wake up to the memory of their shame, the mirror reflections, the accusations on Main Street. They will want to believe it was a mass hallucination, a gas leak. You, sheriff, and you, mayor, must not let them. Hayes, brushing the snow off his official jacket, looked down at the charter. I can't tell them about a 300-year-old witch contract, Elias. I'll be committed. Tell them the truth about the unpaid debt on the waterworks sign. Tell them the truth about the embezzlement you were hiding. Confess the honest modern corruption, and tell them that the darkness will only retreat when they stop lying to themselves and their community. That is the only way to ensure the hag or the hunt never finds a footing here again. The mayor, the politician of pure facade, nodded. He picked up the iron rooster, its head resolute in the darkness. The truth. I'll start with the town council. The final relic. Before leaving the cemetery, Elias performed one last final act of closure. He went back to the founder's grave where the gold coin lay. He gently dug the coin out of the earth. It was still warm from the sacrificial fire. This coin, the single untainted reward from the shadowy sisterhood, was no longer a weapon. It was a relic of redemption. He handed it to Sheriff Brody. This is the price of honesty. It belongs to the town. Keep it safe. Let it be the counter symbol to the tinsel and the plastic, a reminder that true value comes from honesty, not from debt or denial. As the first faint, reluctant glow of the pre-dawn December sky touched the eastern horizon, Elias looked back at the colonial cemetery. The graves were silent, their souls redeemed. The moment of winter silence had lasted just long enough for the truth to triumph. He was exhausted, lonely, and stripped of his obsession, but he was no longer haunted. He had spent his life seeking the truth of folklore, and in the end, that truth had demanded everything he had to save the living.
Surviving the dark side of Christmas. Elias parted with the sheriff and the mayor at the edge of the town square. Hayes, clutching the iron rooster, was heading to the town hall archive to retrieve the modern records of his embezzlement, the necessary final act of public redemption to complement the ritualistic voiding of the ancient pact. He was shedding the lie of his political career to secure the town's future. Brody, exhausted but resolute, promised to ensure the safety of the retrieved gold coin. Elias walked back to his cottage, the rising sun merely a faint, bruised promise on the horizon. His survival had been absolute, but the cost of knowing was overwhelming. He entered his kitchen, the air still faintly sharp with the scent of juniper smoke and the ghosts of fear. He looked at the chaos, the scattered salt lines, the empty skillet, the burnt remnants of the rowan and juniper, the physical proof of his kitchen coven. The items were ordinary, yet they had collectively fought the wild hunt. Then he looked at his bookshelf, the empty space where the compendium of the wild hunt had rested, the space that had defined his career, his identity, and his relationship with his wife, yawned like a physical wound. He had achieved the ultimate validation of his research, proving the lore was real and applying it to save a town. But he had done so by sacrificing the very evidence that justified his life's work. The scholar's void. Elias was no longer a scholar. He was a survivor stripped bare. The knowledge that had been his insulation and his obsession was now gone, leaving behind a profound, aching void. He knew the truth about Oakhaven.
He knew that beneath the gleaming facade of suburban cheer lurked the desperate fear of unpaid debt and the shame of moral laziness, the exact kindling that called the hag and her sisterhood. He had seen the terrifying, seductive perfection of the unsettling gift and felt the cold judgment in the reflection of a simple mirror. This was the dark side of Christmas, not a fairy tale, but a fundamental truth about human nature and the price of light. And he was the only one in Oakhaven who truly knew the price. His victory was incommunicable. He could never go back to lecturing about the socio-cultural function of perkta at a university. He had felt the hag's breath and fought the wild hunt with a frying pan. His new reality was too real, too dangerous to be contained within an academic journal. He slumped onto his sofa. The physical cost was exhaustion, bruises, and the residual cold deep in his bones. The emotional cost was far steeper. Absolute, terrifying loneliness. He had nobody to share his truth with, only companions who were forced to participate and would desperately try to forget. The haunting of memory. The psychic residue was the worst haunting of all. The witch's presence was gone from the square and the cemetery, but it was anchored in Elias's mind. He closed his eyes and immediately saw the tinsel on the miller's porch turning black, screeching as it died. He heard the seductive whisper of Odin, promising to erase his debt and give him back the compendium. He saw the elongated, guilty face in the mirror. He was now perpetually marked by his knowledge. Every cheap commercial jingle would be a reminder of the hag's chaotic music. Every perfectly wrapped gift would carry the threat of the curse. Surviving the dark side of Christmas meant forever seeing the fragile reality behind the festive veil. He looked around the room, realizing he couldn't live in the academic shrine of his past any longer. The compendium was gone. The space must be filled with a new purpose. The path of the silent guardian. Elias made a cup of strong, black coffee, using the last of his honest kitchen supplies. His future lay not in recovering the past, but in silently safeguarding the present. He was Oakhaven's unintentional guardian, bound by the cost of his knowledge. He would watch the town's denial carefully, ready to act if the lie started to breed again. He spotted a small, plastic, neglected Christmas tree in the corner of his study, a cheap, pathetic thing he had bought years ago, a nod to the season he secretly despised. It was currently adorned with a handful of cheap, shiny blue tinsel ornaments. His final act of the morning was to strip the tree bare. He gathered the tinsel, which now felt offensively cheap and plastic in his hands, and threw it into the wood stove, watching it shrivel and melt, a small symbolic burning of the synthetic lie. In its place, he retrieved the small, remaining sprig of dried rowan wood from his herb jar. Rowan, the tree of protection. He tied it to the top branch of the little plastic tree with a piece of plain twine. The tree was no longer festive, but it was honest. It was a token of his new reality, a symbol of vigilance, honest defense, and the sacrifice he had made. Elias had survived the dark side of Christmas. He was alone, his obsession was gone, and his memory was haunted. But he had traded the logic of the forgotten past for the terrifying, active lure of the present. He was now simply a man who knew what lay beyond the tinsel, and he would spend the rest of his Christmases ensuring no one else in Oakhaven had to pay the same price.
Remembering the witches of December. The days following the solstice and the cemetery ritual, December 23rd and 24th, were bathed in the pale, apologetic light of late December sun. Oakhaven was technically safe, but psychologically fractured. The town was moving, breathing, and recovering, but every action was underscored by the lingering trauma. The seasonal scars were visible everywhere. The physical scars. Main Street was still littered with the debris of the supernatural assault, patches of black burnt snow from the spontaneous combustion of tinsel, and the heavy residue of the rock salt circle that now ringed the skeletal spruce. The townspeople meticulously avoided stepping inside the purification boundary, a collective, silent acknowledgement of the ritual they had only witnessed from afar. The once aggressive displays of Christmas cheer were gone. No one was rushing to repair the inflatable Santas or replace the mechanized reindeer. The few lights that remained were simple, warm white, or turned off entirely. The synthetic, dazzling veneer of the American lie had been permanently cracked. Remembering the witches. The most profound scars were psychological, manifesting as strange collective superstitions, the town's subconscious way of remembering the witches of December. The cleaning compulsion. Echoing the hag's punitive nature regarding uncleanliness and laziness, the entire town developed an obsessive compulsion to clean. People were scrubbing their porches, washing windows that didn't look dirty, and sweeping driveways already clear of snow. It was a mass ritualistic attempt to banish the lingering scent of uncleanliness that the hag represented. The mirror panic. The mirrors remained covered. Driven by the fear that their true shame would be reflected, nearly every mirror in Oakhaven was draped with towels, blankets, or newspaper. The logic of the sheriff had failed them. The lore of Elias Vance had provided the only true path to safety. The silence. The aggressive, loud Christmas music that normally blared from every shop was replaced by quiet carols, or, more often, silence. The memory of the spectral hounds baying and the hag's high, reedy judgment had permanently redefined what constituted a safe sound during the Yuletide. The atonement of the mayor. On Christmas Eve, Mayor Hayes delivered the final, necessary piece of the anti-magic. He stood on the steps of the now purified community center, not talking about resilience, but about shame. He didn't mention ancient pacts or cloven heels. He confessed the modern civic truth, his political lies, the embezzlement of civic funds, and the long-suppressed debt from the old waterworks. It was a raw, agonizing confession, the public sacrifice of his career as the final payment for the town's historical and modern moral debt. The town listened in stunned silence, then responded not with anger, but with profound communal relief. The act of public honesty, the first true acknowledgement of corruption in generations, was a cleansing ritual in itself. The hag's power source, the unacknowledged lie, was finally officially shut down. The vigil of the protector. Elias spent Christmas Eve alone in his cottage, performing his final personal vigil. He sat by his small, honest tree, adorned only with the rowan wood protection, drinking tea. He was an observer, a haunted survivor. He watched the lights of Mrs. Peterson's house. She was busy in her kitchen, but she was only baking simple, unsweetened bread. The honest labor that had appeased the wild hunt. Her seasonal scar was a renewed devotion to humble thrift. He received a short text message from Sheriff Brody. The coin is safe, locked in the safe, guarded by the rooster. The sheriff's scar was a permanent, quiet acceptance of the lore's necessity. Elias realized that the witches of December had not only terrorized Oakhaven, they had purified it. The town was bruised, terrified, and ashamed, but for the first time in its history, it was celebrating a Christmas based on honesty and humility rather than debt and synthetic excess. The aggressive cheer was gone, replaced by a quiet communal appreciation for survival. As the church bells rang softly for the midnight mass, the sound was clear, humble, and pure, no longer fighting against the psychic static of guilt. Elias felt the familiar ache of his sacrifice, the cost of knowing. But it was tempered by the profound satisfaction of a guardian who had successfully protected his charge not through strength, but through the courage of the truth. He knew that every December, When the tinsel came out and the lights went up, the people of Oakhaven would feel a collective subconscious shiver. They would compulsively clean their homes, check their locks, and look twice at the reflections in their mirrors. They wouldn't know why, but they would be remembering the witches of December.
A new understanding of winter's magic. Christmas morning dawned cold and brilliant over Oakhaven. The sun, having vanquished the longest night, shone with the hard, crystalline clarity on the snow. The town was quiet. The manic, aggressive cheer of previous years was absent, replaced by a profound, humble stillness. Elias Vance stood at his window, watching the few figures moving in the street. There was no rush, no loud excitement, only the slow, deliberate movements of people valuing silence and warmth. Mayor Hayes, stripped of his political lie, was spotted walking to the church, his posture one of quiet atonement. Elias knew that across Oakhaven, people were celebrating a truly honest Christmas, a celebration born not from commercial obligation, but from shared, terrifying survival. The spell was broken, but the magic was not gone. It was merely balanced. The everlasting chill. Elias poured himself coffee and sat by his small tree, adorned only with the simple rowan wood. He reflected on the nature of his victory and the new understanding of winter's magic he had gained at the ultimate personal cost. The everlasting chill was not the temperature of the air. It was the persistent, sober awareness that the ancient dark forces were always waiting for a lapse in human integrity. The hag and the hunt were not defeated by power. They were defeated by the truth, the simple, humble honesty that they respected as the only form of true currency. Elias had spent his life seeking the complex lore. He now understood the simple logic of the universe. Perchta and La Befana are two sides of the same entity, punishment and reward. You must offer the gruel, the humble honesty, to get the gold coin, the earned reward. The American Christmas had offered synthetic cheer instead, creating the vacuum that summoned the hag. The wild hunt seeks chaos and the exposed. It is repelled by domestic order, iron, salt, fire, proving that civilization's oldest rituals are its most potent defense. His new understanding was that winter's magic was fundamentally cyclical and dualistic. It demanded accountability. The chill was eternal because the cycle of human denial and moral debt was eternal. He knew that the town would eventually forget the specific terror, but the seasonal scars, the compulsion to clean, the fear of the mirror, the suspicion of cheap tinsel would remain, woven into the cultural fabric as a permanent, unconscious warning. A new purpose in vigilance. He picked up his phone. He received a short, final message from Agnes Crofton, the former weaver. "My hearth is clean, wishing you quiet warmth." A perfect, tacit acknowledgement of their shared trauma and victory. He called Sheriff Brody, who answered immediately, his voice low. "Merry Christmas, Elias. I just checked the safe. The rooster is guarding the coin. It's the safest thing in Oakhaven. Keep it safe, Sheriff. It's the town's most valuable relic now, the symbol of its earned honesty." Elias knew his own role was settled. He couldn't leave Oakhaven. He couldn't go back to the world of detached academia. He was bound to the town by the sheer cost of knowing and the sacrifice of the compendium. He was the silent custodian of Oakhaven's integrity. His everlasting chill was his constant, necessary vigilance against the return of the lie. He was no longer hunting for a secret history. He was actively guarding the truth of the present. Elias looked at the single, final relic he kept, the small, charred remnants of the compendium pages he had failed to sacrifice, the parts that spoke of the hag's eternal cycle. They were useless as evidence, but invaluable as a reminder. He tucked them away not in a vault, but in the deepest drawer of his humble kitchen table, a hidden sacred text for his kitchen coven. The sun finally rose high enough to cast a pale, weak light directly into his cottage. It illuminated the rowan wood on his tree, casting a small, protective shadow. Elias sat down to his humble, solitary Christmas breakfast. The chill was always there, a reminder of the night the witches came to Oakhaven, demanding honesty and debt repayment. But the chill was no longer a threat. It was a promise that as long as he remembered the truth, and as long as Oakhaven valued honesty over tinsel, they would survive the dark side of Christmas year after year. The true magic of winter was not chaos, but the demanding, dualistic power of truth.